For many professionals, the relationship with money is shaped less by the desire to gain wealth and more by the fear of losing it. This fear rarely presents itself openly. It does not usually appear as panic or visible anxiety. Instead, it operates quietly beneath daily decisions, influencing behavior in ways that feel rational, responsible, and even intelligent. The fear of financial loss often disguises itself as caution, prudence, or maturity, making it difficult to recognize how deeply it governs modern professional life. Early financial experiences play a significant role in forming this relationship. Individuals who grew up in middle-class environments often internalize subtle lessons about stability and risk long before they began earning significant income. Money represented safety. Security depended on avoiding mistakes. Financial loss carried emotional meaning far beyond numerical value. Even when adulthood brings higher income and professional stability, the emotional memory of vulnerability remains active. As careers progress, income begins to provide comfort, but comfort introduces something unexpected: attachment. The more stability individuals achieve, the more there is to protect. Savings accounts grow, investments accumulate, lifestyles stabilize, and responsibilities expand. Wealth stops representing possibility alone and begins representing preservation. This is where fear quietly strengthens. Losing money feels psychologically different from gaining it. Research in behavioral economics consistently shows that losses create stronger emotional reactions than equivalent gains create satisfaction. The professional mind interprets financial loss not merely as a setback, but as a personal failure of judgment. Intelligence, competence, and identity feel indirectly threatened. Financial decisions start prioritizing avoidance over opportunity. Many professionals believe they are acting logically when they hesitate to invest, delay career transitions, or avoid calculated risks. From the outside, these choices appear careful and responsible. Internally, however, the motivation often stems from a deeper psychological impulse, the desire to prevent regression. Progress becomes something fragile that must be defended. The irony is that financial stability can amplify fear rather than eliminate it. When income was limited, risks sometimes felt unavoidable because advancement required action. But once comfort exists, protecting what has been built becomes emotionally compelling. The potential downside of change begins feeling heavier than the potential upside of growth. Fear shifts decision-making toward preservation. You may notice how professionals with strong earnings sometimes remain in roles that no longer align with their interests or long-term goals. The hesitation rarely comes from lack of ability. It arises from uncertainty about losing income continuity. The mind imagines worst-case outcomes vividly while underestimating adaptability and resilience. Money becomes tied to emotional safety. This connection transforms financial behavior subtly. Investments may become overly conservative. Opportunities requiring temporary discomfort are postponed. Long-term wealth strategies weaken because short-term stability feels more urgent. Fear does not eliminate ambition, it redirects it toward maintaining certainty. Now something important becomes visible. The fear of losing money is rarely about money alone. It reflects fear of losing identity, status, or perceived progress. Financial loss symbolizes movement backward, and backward movement challenges deeply held beliefs about success. Professionals accustomed to upward trajectories struggle emotionally with uncertainty because their lives have reinforced a narrative of continuous improvement. Yet, wealth building inherently involves uncertainty. Every meaningful financial advancement contains the possibility of temporary decline. Markets fluctuate, career paths evolve unpredictably, innovation requires experimentation. Avoiding all loss inevitably limits exposure to growth. The paradox emerges quietly. The stronger the fear of losing money becomes, the more life organizes itself around protection rather than expansion. Understanding this dynamic does not require abandoning caution. Fear itself serves an important evolutionary function. It protects against reckless decisions and encourages thoughtful planning. The challenge arises when fear stops informing decisions and begins controlling them. When protection becomes the dominant priority, financial life narrows. Choices become safer but smaller. Opportunities remain theoretical rather than experienced. Stability increases while freedom remains distant. Recognizing the quiet power of financial fear marks the beginning of a deeper conversation, one that explores how intelligent, capable individuals can unknowingly allow the fear of loss to shape not only their money decisions, but the structure of their entire lives. Now we will explore why the fear of losing money carries such disproportionate influence over financial behavior, even among highly rational and analytical professionals. Human psychology is not naturally designed for modern financial systems. For most of human history, survival depended far more on avoiding loss than on pursuing gain. Losing resources once meant immediate danger, less food, less protection, fewer chances of survival. The brain evolved to treat loss as urgent and threatening, while gains were experienced as beneficial but not essential. That ancient wiring still operates today, even inside sophisticated economic environments. When professionals evaluate financial decisions, the logical mind calculates potential outcomes, but the emotional system weighs losses more heavily than equivalent rewards. A potential investment gain may appear attractive intellectually, yet the possibility of loss generates stronger emotional resistance. The imbalance happens automatically. Loss feels personal. A decline in investments, an unsuccessful business decision, or even a temporary income reduction often creates internal narratives about judgment and competence. Instead of viewing loss as part of statistical probability, individuals interpret it as evidence of poor decision-making. Ego and fear merge, reinforcing cautious behavior. The result is not irrational avoidance, but psychological asymmetry. Gains produce satisfaction, losses produce stress. Because stress demands resolution, the mind begins structuring financial decisions around minimizing discomfort rather than maximizing opportunity. Preservation becomes emotionally rewarding because it reduces anxiety immediately. This explains why many professionals accumulate savings successfully yet struggle to transition toward wealth-building strategies requiring uncertainty. Holding cash feels safe. Avoiding risk feels intelligent. Stability provides emotional relief, even when long-term growth slows. Fear disguises itself as responsibility. You may notice how financial conversations often emphasize avoiding mistakes more than creating opportunities. Discussions focus on protecting capital, preventing downturn exposure, or maintaining security. These priorities appear prudent, and often they are. But over time, excessive protection limits participation in growth environments where wealth compounds. The mind prefers certainty, even when certainty carries hidden cost. Now, something subtle emerges. Professionals who experienced financial instability earlier in life often develop heightened sensitivity to loss. Even after achieving strong income and savings, the emotional memory of vulnerability remains active. The brain continues operating as if stability could disappear suddenly. Financial progress does not automatically update emotional perception. This explains why individuals earning comfortable incomes sometimes feel financially anxious despite objective security. The fear of loss is not responding to current reality alone. It is responding to remembered uncertainty. Loss aversion also influences career decisions in powerful ways. Opportunities involving temporary risk, entrepreneurship, career transitions, geographic moves, or reduced short-term income can appear disproportionately dangerous. The mind compares guaranteed stability with uncertain improvement and instinctively chooses preservation. Fear favors continuation over exploration. Over long periods, this pattern creates an invisible ceiling. Professionals advance steadily but rarely dramatically. Growth occurs within safe boundaries. Financial independence remains a distant concept because the behaviors required to reach it involve tolerating temporary volatility. Wealth building requires interaction with uncertainty. Those who accumulate lasting wealth do not eliminate fear, they reinterpret it. Instead of viewing loss as failure, they understand it as information. Temporary decline becomes part of participation rather than evidence of incompetence. This reframing weakens fear's control. Financial maturity involves recognizing that avoiding all losses often means avoiding meaningful gains. Markets reward participation across time rather than perfection at individual moments. Careers evolve through experimentation rather than uninterrupted certainty. Ego seeks proof of correctness. Wealth grows through resilience. When professionals begin separating emotional discomfort from actual danger, decision-making expands. Risk becomes measurable rather than threatening. Opportunities become evaluative choices instead of psychological threats. And once loss stops feeling like personal failure, money decisions begin shifting from defensive protection toward deliberate growth, allowing financial life to move beyond preservation into genuine expansion. When safety becomes the real risk. Next, we begin to understand one of the most counterintuitive dynamics in modern financial life: the moment when pursuing safety too aggressively becomes a hidden form of risk. For many professionals, financial responsibility has always meant avoiding instability. Education, career choices, and long-term planning were guided by a clear objective: reduce uncertainty. Stable employment, predictable income, and cautious financial behavior became symbols of maturity and intelligence. These choices often produced real progress, reinforcing the belief that minimizing risk is the correct long-term strategy. But something changes once stability is achieved. The behaviors that created security can gradually start limiting growth. Remaining in familiar environments feels safe because outcomes are known. Income arrives consistently. Financial obligations are manageable. Life operates within predictable boundaries. Safety becomes comfortable, and comfort alters perception. The professional mind begins interpreting change itself as danger. Opportunities involving uncertainty, new ventures, investment exposure, strategic career shifts appear disruptive to stability. Even when potential benefits are significant, the emotional cost of uncertainty feels heavier than the intellectual promise of improvement. Fear reframes action as threat. Over time, this creates a subtle psychological trap. Individuals believe they are protecting themselves from risk, yet they are quietly accepting a different kind of vulnerability: dependence on existing conditions remaining unchanged. The world, however, rarely remains unchanged. Industries evolve. Technology reshapes roles, economic cycles shift. The stability that once felt permanent reveals itself as temporary. Avoiding uncertainty does not eliminate risk. It concentrates risk into a single predictable path. Safety becomes fragile when it lacks adaptability. Now something important becomes visible. Financial fear often narrows imagination. Professionals begin optimizing within current circumstances rather than exploring alternative possibilities. Growth becomes incremental because exploration feels emotionally expensive. The fear of losing stability prevents the creation of future flexibility. This dynamic appears frequently in career decisions. Individuals remain in roles long after curiosity fades or learning slows, not because opportunity is absent, but because leaving introduces uncertainty. The mind values continuity more than potential expansion. From a psychological perspective, this feels responsible. From a wealth-building perspective, it can quietly delay progress. Wealth rarely develops through absolute certainty. It grows through repeated engagement with manageable uncertainty. Investments fluctuate. Skills evolve. Opportunities require temporary discomfort. Avoiding these experiences limits exposure to environments where compounding occurs. The paradox is subtle. Refusing small risks often increases long-term risk. Professionals who avoid volatility entirely may protect short-term stability while sacrificing adaptability. Financial independence requires optionality, the ability to respond to change rather than depend on permanence. Fear encourages preservation. Wealth rewards flexibility. This does not suggest reckless behavior or unnecessary disruption. The distinction lies between intelligent caution and defensive stagnation. Intelligent caution evaluates risk thoughtfully. Defensive stagnation avoids risk reflexively. Over time, the difference shapes financial outcomes dramatically. When safety becomes the primary objective, decisions prioritize maintaining the present. When adaptability becomes the objective, decisions prioritize preparing for the future. Now the perspective shifts slightly. Many individuals discover that the greatest financial risk was never temporary loss, but prolonged hesitation. Opportunities missed rarely feel dramatic in the moment, yet their cumulative effect shapes long-term trajectories. The absence of loss can create the absence of growth. Understanding this changes how fear is interpreted. Instead of asking how to avoid uncertainty completely, financially mature individuals begin asking which uncertainties are worth engaging with deliberately. They accept that progress requires interaction with change. And once safety is no longer treated as the ultimate goal, financial decisions expand beyond preservation, allowing wealth to develop not through perfect protection, but through thoughtful participation in an evolving world. The psychological weight of financial loss. Now we will explore why financial loss feels heavier than logic suggests, and how this emotional weight quietly reshapes the way professionals live, work, and make decisions. When money is lost, whether through market fluctuations, a failed investment, or an unexpected expense, the reaction rarely remains financial. The experience carries psychological meaning. Loss interrupts a sense of progress. It challenges expectations about control and competence. Even small setbacks can produce disproportionate emotional responses because the mind interprets loss symbolically rather than mathematically. Money represents accumulated effort. Every dollar saved or invested reflects time spent working, decisions made carefully, and sacrifices accepted along the way. Losing money therefore feels like losing pieces of personal history. The emotional response is not only about numbers declining, it is about effort appearing undone. This emotional connection strengthens fear. Professionals accustomed to achievement often internalize success as evidence of capability. When financial outcomes decline, even temporarily, the mind searches for explanation. Instead of viewing loss as part of normal volatility, individuals may interpret it as a mistake they should have anticipated. Ego and fear reinforce each other. The brain attempts to avoid repeating emotional discomfort by becoming more cautious. Future decisions become influenced less by probability and more by memory. The pain of previous loss lingers longer than the satisfaction of previous gains. Over time, this creates behavioral patterns. Investors hesitate after downturns. Professionals avoid opportunities resembling earlier setbacks. Financial decisions prioritize emotional safety rather than rational evaluation. The goal subtly shifts from building wealth to preventing regret. Regret avoidance becomes a powerful motivator. What makes this dynamic particularly influential is its invisibility. Individuals often believe they are acting prudently, unaware that past emotional experiences are shaping present judgment. The mind equates reduced exposure with reduced vulnerability. Yet, avoiding exposure also limits participation. Financial systems reward long-term engagement despite short-term fluctuations. Market cycles include decline as naturally as growth. Career progress includes missteps as naturally as advancement. Attempting to eliminate all loss removes access to environments where compounding occurs. Fear interprets volatility as danger. Wealth interprets volatility as process. Now something subtle begins to appear. Financial loss feels heavier, partly because society emphasizes success narratives while minimizing discussion of setbacks. Professionals are surrounded by examples of achievement, but rarely by transparent conversations about mistakes or temporary decline. This creates distorted expectations. Individuals assume losses are exceptional rather than normal. When setbacks occur, they feel isolated or uniquely responsible, strengthening emotional resistance toward future risk-taking. But loss is not deviation, it is participation. Financial maturity involves recognizing that discomfort does not necessarily indicate error. Emotional reactions evolved for survival, not investing or long-term planning. The brain treats uncertainty as threat even when uncertainty is essential for growth. Understanding this reduces the psychological weight attached to loss. Instead of interpreting setbacks as personal failure, individuals begin viewing them as information within broader timelines. The emotional intensity decreases. Decisions regain balance between caution and opportunity. Now the perspective shifts again. The professionals who ultimately achieve financial independence are rarely those who avoid loss entirely. They are those who learn to coexist with it without allowing fear to dominate future choices. They accept temporary discomfort in exchange for long-term resilience. Money stops representing perfection and starts representing adaptation. Decisions become guided by probabilities rather than emotions. Progress becomes measured across years instead of moments. And once financial loss loses its symbolic power, fear begins to loosen its grip, allowing wealth building to proceed with clarity rather than constant emotional defense. Next, we begin to understand that the fear of losing money rarely stays confined to financial choices alone. Over time, it begins influencing something even more consequential: career behavior. For many professionals, income represents stability, identity, and predictability simultaneously. A career is not only a source of earnings, but also a structure organizing daily life, social belonging, and personal confidence. Because income feels central to security, Decisions about work gradually become guided by the desire to avoid financial disruption rather than the pursuit of meaningful advancement. Fear shifts the purpose of work. Instead of asking whether a role encourages growth, learning, or long-term alignment, individuals begin asking whether change might threaten stability. Opportunities that introduce uncertainty, transitioning industries, pursuing entrepreneurship, negotiating aggressively, or stepping into unfamiliar responsibilities, trigger psychological resistance. The resistance rarely feels like fear. It feels practical, responsible, mature. Remaining where income feels predictable appears intelligent, especially after years spent building financial stability. The mind calculates potential downside vividly while minimizing adaptability and future opportunity. The possibility of temporary income fluctuation feels heavier than the possibility of long-term expansion. Fear reframes risk as danger rather than exploration. You may notice how professionals often stay longer in environments that no longer challenge or inspire them. Performance remains strong, compensation remains acceptable, yet curiosity fades. The hesitation to move forward rarely reflects lack of ambition. It reflects attachment to financial continuity. Money becomes an anchor. Over time, this attachment can create a quiet form of dependency. Career decisions prioritize protecting existing income streams rather than increasing future flexibility. Growth slows, not because opportunity disappears, but because the cost of uncertainty feels emotionally unacceptable. Notice how this dynamic operates subtly. The fear is not necessarily about immediate financial hardship. Many professionals possess sufficient savings and strong employability. The fear instead concerns identity disruption, the possibility of appearing unstable or temporarily uncertain after years of steady progress. Financial fear becomes reputational fear. Ego and security merge, reinforcing cautious behavior. Remaining in familiar roles provides reassurance that life remains under control. Yet long-term wealth often depends on strategic periods of change, moments when individuals tolerate uncertainty in exchange for expanded opportunity. Avoiding these moments limits exposure to transformation. The paradox becomes clearer with time. Professionals who prioritize stability excessively may protect short-term income while sacrificing long-term leverage. Skills stagnate, networks narrow, optionality decreases. Financial life becomes dependent on continuity rather than adaptability. Wealth favors adaptability. Those who build lasting independence often treat careers as evolving platforms rather than permanent structures. They accept that periods of transition may temporarily reduce certainty but increase long-term agency. Fear does not disappear for them, it simply stops dictating direction. Now the perspective shifts slightly. The fear of losing money often masks a deeper concern. The fear of discovering whether one can succeed under new conditions. Stability protects not only income, but also self-image. Change introduces unknown evaluation. Remaining still avoids emotional exposure. Yet, financial independence ultimately requires confidence in adaptability, rather than confidence in permanence. The ability to generate value across changing environments becomes more powerful than preserving any single source of income. When professionals begin viewing careers through this lens, fear loosens its influence. Decisions expand beyond protection toward intentional design. Income becomes one component of life rather than its governing force. And once career decisions are guided by growth rather than avoidance, money gradually shifts from something that must be defended into something that can be developed, opening pathways toward wealth built through evolution rather than preservation alone. Next, we begin to understand how fear of losing money often transforms saving, one of the most responsible financial behaviors, into something psychologically protective rather than strategically effective. Saving money feels unquestionably wise. It signals discipline, foresight, and maturity. For many professionals, the ability to accumulate savings represents a major milestone, especially after years of financial uncertainty earlier in life. Watching account balances grow creates a sense of relief. Stability feels tangible. Anxiety softens because resources exist as protection against unforeseen events. Saving provides emotional control. The presence of cash or low-risk assets reassures the mind that vulnerability has decreased. Emergencies feel manageable. Career disruptions appear less threatening. Financial independence seems closer, simply because reserves exist. But something subtle begins to happen. when fear drives saving behavior. The purpose of saving shifts quietly from preparation to protection. Instead of functioning as a foundation for growth, savings become a psychological shield against uncertainty. Holding money begins to feel safer than deploying it productively. Fear interprets inactivity as security. Many professionals accumulate substantial reserves, yet hesitate to move beyond them. Investing feels risky. Business opportunities feel uncertain. Even calculated financial decisions can trigger discomfort because they involve the possibility of temporary loss. Cash becomes emotional reassurance rather than strategic capital. This behavior rarely appears irrational. Maintaining liquidity feels prudent, especially in unpredictable economic environments. Yet over long periods, excessive attachment to safety introduces hidden cost. Inflation erodes purchasing power. Opportunities pass unengaged. Wealth compounds more slowly than potential allows. The illusion of control emerges. Saving creates the feeling that uncertainty has been neutralized, even though financial systems remain dynamic. Money held without purposeful deployment protects against volatility, but also limits participation in growth. Stability becomes static. Fear prioritizes preservation over expansion. Now something important becomes visible. The challenge is not saving itself. Saving remains essential. The issue arises when saving becomes the final objective rather than the beginning of strategy. Financial security requires both defense and engagement. Without engagement, security gradually weakens. Professionals influenced by fear often delay transition from saving to investing because the emotional comfort of certainty outweighs the intellectual understanding of long-term growth. Knowledge alone does not overcome fear. Emotional safety maintains stronger influence than mathematical logic. This explains why many intelligent individuals remain overly conservative despite understanding investment principles thoroughly. The mind equates movement with exposure. Wealth builders gradually reframe this relationship. They begin viewing savings not as permanent shelter, but as preparation for participation. Reserves exist to create confidence in engaging with uncertainty, not avoiding it indefinitely. Saving becomes permission rather than protection. This shift changes emotional experience. Deploying capital no longer feels reckless because the purpose of savings is fulfilled. Fear decreases when individuals recognize that financial security was meant to enable action, not replace it. Now the perspective shifts again. True financial control does not come from eliminating uncertainty. It comes from developing systems resilient enough to function within uncertainty. Diversification, long-term investment horizons, and adaptability provide stability more effectively than permanent avoidance. Ego seeks certainty. Wealth requires engagement. When professionals recognize that saving alone cannot produce independence, financial behavior evolves naturally. Money begins moving intentionally toward opportunities aligned with long-term objectives. Fear remains present but loses authority over decision-making. And once savings transform from emotional protection into strategic foundation, financial life expands beyond preservation, allowing wealth to grow through participation rather than remain confined within the comforting illusion of control. Next, we begin to understand how fear of losing money expresses itself not through obvious avoidance, but through delay, the quiet habit of waiting for the perfect moment. Waiting feels rational. Professionals are trained to analyze conditions, gather information, and reduce uncertainty before acting. Preparation signals intelligence. Careful timing appears responsible. In financial life, patience is often praised as wisdom, yet fear subtly reshapes patience into hesitation. Many individuals believe they are waiting for clarity when they are actually waiting for emotional certainty. They postpone investing until markets feel stable, delay career moves until risk disappears, and hold off on strategic decisions until outcomes appear predictable. The problem is that certainty rarely arrives. Financial environments are inherently uncertain. Markets fluctuate continuously. Opportunities evolve unpredictably. Career trajectories shift without clear signals. Waiting for perfect conditions becomes an endless process because uncertainty never fully resolves. Fear disguises inaction as prudence. The mind convinces itself that postponement reduces risk, but time itself carries cost. Compounding requires participation. Skills grow through engagement. Opportunities often reward early involvement rather than flawless timing. Delay quietly becomes the most expensive decision. You may notice how professionals revisit the same financial intentions repeatedly. Plans to invest, diversify income, negotiate compensation, or pursue long-term goals remain conceptually clear yet unexecuted. The individual understands what should be done but feels an internal resistance, difficult to explain logically. That resistance is rarely ignorance. It is fear attempting to avoid regret. The possibility of acting at the wrong moment feels emotionally heavier than the cost of inaction. The mind imagines future disappointment vividly, buying before a downturn, changing careers before uncertainty, committing resources before complete confidence exists. Avoiding regret becomes the hidden objective. Over time, however, the absence of action creates a different form of regret, one that appears gradually rather than suddenly. Years pass with stable but limited progress. Financial life remains secure but unchanged. The opportunity cost of waiting accumulates invisibly. Fear protects against short-term mistakes while increasing long-term stagnation. Now something subtle becomes visible. Professionals often believe successful individuals act with greater certainty. In reality, most meaningful financial decisions occur under incomplete information. Progress depends less on perfect timing and more on repeated participation. Wealth favors consistent engagement over flawless decisions. Those who build lasting financial independence accept that some decisions will occur imperfectly. They allow themselves to act despite uncertainty, trusting adaptability more than prediction. Mistakes become part of the process rather than events to avoid entirely. Fear seeks guarantees. Growth accepts probability. This shift does not encourage impulsive behavior. Thoughtful evaluation remains essential. The difference lies in recognizing when additional waiting no longer improves decision quality, but simply reduces emotional discomfort. When awareness increases, action becomes easier. Professionals begin moving forward with measured steps instead of waiting for complete assurance. Progress resumes because decisions align with long-term intention rather than short-term emotional relief. And once fear loses its ability to postpone action indefinitely, financial life begins regaining momentum, allowing wealth to develop not through perfect timing, but through the quiet power of consistent participation over time. Now the perspective shifts toward one of the deepest psychological drivers behind financial fear, the human desire for certainty in a world that does not provide it. Modern professional life rewards predictability. Careers operate through structured timelines, promotions follow performance cycles, salaries arrive on fixed schedules. Over time, the brain learns to associate stability with competence and control. Predictable outcomes feel safe because they reinforce the belief that effort leads reliably to reward. Money becomes intertwined with this expectation. Financial stability appears to promise certainty about the future. Savings suggest preparedness. Stable income suggests continuity. Carefully planned investments suggest control over long-term outcomes. Professionals naturally seek financial systems that reduce ambiguity because ambiguity creates psychological tension. Fear intensifies when certainty disappears. Market volatility, economic changes, or unexpected life events challenge the illusion that outcomes can be fully controlled. Even temporary uncertainty can feel disproportionately stressful because it interrupts the narrative of stability, carefully built over years. The mind begins searching for guarantees. Investments that fluctuate feel uncomfortable. Career paths without predictable progression feel risky. Financial strategies requiring patience feel unsettling because results cannot be observed immediately. The emotional response is not simply concern about money, it is discomfort with unpredictability itself. Certainty becomes emotionally addictive. You may notice how individuals gravitate toward financial decisions promising clarity, even when those decisions limit long-term growth. Guaranteed outcomes feel calming regardless of whether they maximize opportunity. The absence of volatility provides psychological relief. Fear prefers predictability over possibility. Yet financial systems do not reward certainty consistently. High levels of predictability often correspond with limited growth potential. Opportunities offering meaningful expansion usually involve uncertainty, not reckless risk, but conditions where outcomes cannot be fully known in advance. This creates an internal conflict. The analytical mind understands the necessity of uncertainty for growth, while the emotional mind seeks protection from discomfort. Professionals find themselves intellectually confident yet emotionally hesitant. Decisions remain cautious even when logic supports broader participation. The need for certainty becomes invisible constraint. Now something subtle becomes visible. The desire for certainty is often mistaken for rationality. Individuals believe they are making careful decisions when they are actually prioritizing emotional comfort. Fear transforms unpredictability into perceived danger, but uncertainty itself is neutral. Wealth builders eventually recognize that financial maturity involves developing tolerance for ambiguity rather than eliminating it. They stop searching for perfect forecasts and begin constructing systems resilient enough to function without certainty. Confidence shifts from prediction to adaptability. Instead of asking whether outcomes are guaranteed, they ask whether they can respond effectively, regardless of outcome. This change reduces emotional dependence on stability. Uncertainty becomes manageable because identity no longer depends on controlling every variable. Fear loses authority when uncertainty becomes acceptable. Professionals who reach this stage often experience unexpected calm. Financial decisions feel lighter because they no longer require absolute assurance. Progress continues despite imperfect information. Long-term strategies remain intact through temporary volatility. Ego seeks certainty as proof of control. Wealth grows through acceptance of the unknown. And once certainty stops being the primary objective, financial life expands beyond protection, allowing individuals to engage with opportunity confidently, not because risk disappears, but because resilience replaces the need for guarantees. Next, we begin to understand one of the most subtle consequences of fearing financial loss, not dramatic failure, but gradual contraction. Fear rarely announces itself loudly. It does not usually force obvious retreat. Instead, it quietly narrows the range of acceptable decisions. Over time, individuals stop noticing how many possibilities they no longer consider. The financial world becomes smaller. At first, this contraction feels like maturity. Professionals refine routines, stabilize income streams, and reduce unnecessary volatility. Life becomes efficient and predictable. Decisions feel responsible because fewer variables remain uncertain. But beneath this stability, fear begins shaping perception. Opportunities that once seemed interesting start feeling impractical. Career experiments appear unnecessary. Investments outside familiar territory feel uncomfortable. Even conversations about alternative paths may create subtle resistance. The mind begins filtering reality through safety. Fear does not eliminate ambition. It redirects it toward maintenance. Energy focuses on preserving what already exists rather than exploring what could exist. Financial life becomes centered around protecting position instead of expanding possibility. This shift happens slowly enough that it rarely feels restrictive. Professionals continue progressing incrementally. Promotions occur, income increases modestly, stability strengthens. Yet a quiet tension develops, a sense that freedom is not expanding at the same pace as success. The reason lies in psychological boundaries rather than financial limits. Fear teaches the brain to avoid situations that might produce loss, embarrassment, or uncertainty. Each avoided risk reinforces the belief that safety equals wisdom. Over years, the range of acceptable decisions narrows so gradually that contraction feels normal. Comfort replaces curiosity. You may notice how individuals stop exploring unfamiliar investments, avoid geographic mobility, or decline opportunities requiring temporary discomfort. These decisions often appear rational individually, but collectively, they reduce exposure to environments where transformative growth occurs. Fear converts optional choices into perceived dangers. The financial world becomes defined by what must not be lost rather than what could be created. Stability strengthens while adaptability weakens. Independence remains theoretical because life depends heavily on maintaining existing structures. Wealth requires expansion of possibility. Those who achieve lasting financial freedom tend to maintain openness even after achieving stability. They continue evaluating new ideas, learning unfamiliar systems, and tolerating measured uncertainty. Their world remains wide because fear does not determine boundaries. The difference is psychological rather than financial. Now something important becomes visible. Fear narrows attention toward downside scenarios while obscuring upside potential. The mind becomes skilled at imagining what could go wrong, but less practiced at envisioning what could improve. Over time, imagination itself contracts. When imagination shrinks, financial behavior follows. Goals become conservative, expectations lower subtly. Decisions optimize for continuation instead of transformation. Fear protects against loss but quietly limits growth. Financial maturity involves recognizing this contraction early. Individuals begin asking whether caution is serving long-term freedom or merely preserving emotional comfort. They intentionally reintroduce exploration, not recklessly but thoughtfully. Small expansions rebuild confidence. Each engagement with uncertainty weakens fear's influence. The financial world widens again. Opportunities become visible where previously only risk appeared. Progress accelerates, not because fear disappears, but because it no longer defines boundaries. And once fear stops shrinking perception, money begins serving possibility again, allowing wealth to develop within an expanding world rather than a carefully protected one. Next, we begin to understand a consequence of financial fear that rarely appears in traditional discussions about wealth: the emotional cost of constant protection. Protecting money feels responsible. It reflects discipline, awareness, and long-term thinking. Many professionals pride themselves on avoiding unnecessary risk, maintaining financial order, and ensuring stability for the future. From an external perspective, these behaviors represent maturity. Yet internally, continuous protection can create subtle psychological strain. When financial life becomes centered around avoiding loss, money stops functioning as a tool and begins functioning as something fragile. Decisions carry emotional weight because each choice feels capable of disrupting stability. Spending creates hesitation. Investing creates tension. Change introduces anxiety. Money becomes something that must be guarded constantly. This mental posture requires energy. The mind remains alert to potential threats, market downturns, economic changes, career disruptions, unexpected expenses. Even during stable periods, attention quietly scans for danger. Fear turns financial awareness into vigilance. Over time, vigilance produces exhaustion. Professionals may not describe themselves as financially stressed, yet they experience persistent underlying tension. Success exists, savings exist, but relaxation feels incomplete because stability always appears temporary. The emotional burden remains invisible. You may notice how individuals hesitate to enjoy resources they worked hard to build. Purchases feel accompanied by internal negotiation. Opportunities for experiences are evaluated primarily through potential loss rather than potential meaning. Wealth exists numerically, but does not fully translate into psychological freedom. Protection becomes limitation. This dynamic reveals an important paradox. The purpose of wealth is often imagined as reducing anxiety and increasing choice. Yet when fear dominates financial thinking, wealth accumulation can coexist with emotional restriction. The individual becomes financially secure, but psychologically cautious. Fear encourages viewing money as something that could disappear at any moment. Even strong financial positions fail to create comfort because the mind remains oriented toward preservation. Instead of asking how money can support life, attention focuses on how life must adjust to protect money. The relationship reverses. Now something subtle becomes visible. Financial fear often originates from earlier periods of instability, but it persists long after circumstances change. Emotional memory updates more slowly than financial reality. Individuals continue behaving defensively even when objective risk has decreased significantly. The brain protects past vulnerability. Wealth builders who eventually experience genuine financial calm undergo a psychological shift. They recognize that excessive protection carries its own cost. Money preserved without purpose can quietly restrict living just as much as financial scarcity once did. Balance replaces defense. Protection remains necessary, but it becomes proportional rather than dominant. Financial planning aims not only to prevent loss, but also to enable meaningful engagement with life. Decisions begin integrating both security and fulfillment. Fear loses authority when money stops representing survival alone. Instead, money becomes a resource supporting intentional living, allowing individuals to accept reasonable uncertainty while maintaining stability. Emotional energy returns because vigilance decreases. Financial decisions feel lighter because identity no longer depends on perfect preservation. Ego seeks absolute safety. Wealth offers relative security. And once protection stops consuming emotional attention, financial life begins fulfilling its deeper purpose, not merely avoiding loss, but creating the space to live with confidence, rather than constant defense. Next, we begin to understand the psychological shift that gradually weakens fear's control over financial life. Learning to trust not just money itself, but your ability to recover if money is lost. Fear of losing money rarely comes from numbers alone. It comes from a belief that loss would be irreversible. The mind imagines decline as permanent, imagining scenarios where recovery feels impossible or painfully slow. Even small financial risks begin to feel threatening when the brain assumes that setbacks would fundamentally disrupt stability. What fear truly questions is resilience. Professionals often place confidence in accumulated assets while underestimating the value of their own adaptability. Years of education, experience, skill development, and professional relationships represent powerful forms of capital, yet emotional focus remains fixed on financial balances rather than personal capability. Money feels fragile when self-trust is limited. You may notice how individuals react differently to identical financial situations. Some tolerate volatility calmly, while others experience intense anxiety despite similar resources. The difference often lies not in wealth itself, but in perceived ability to recover from loss. Those who trust recovery fear loss less. Modern professional identity frequently reinforces the opposite mindset. Careers reward consistency, predictability, and upward movement. Setbacks feel unusual because professional trajectories often emphasize continuous improvement. As a result, the possibility of regression appears psychologically unacceptable. Fear equates loss with failure. Yet long-term wealth building rarely follows a perfectly linear path. Market cycles include decline. Career evolution includes experimentation. Innovation includes mistakes. Individuals who ultimately achieve lasting independence experience periods of uncertainty without allowing those periods to redefine their identity. Recovery becomes part of the process rather than an exception. Now something subtle becomes visible. Fear decreases when individuals shift attention away from protecting every dollar toward strengthening adaptability. Skills, networks, learning capacity, and decision-making ability create resilience that financial assets alone cannot provide. Wealth expands when identity shifts from ownership to capability. Instead of asking how to avoid every potential loss, financially mature individuals begin asking whether they could rebuild if necessary. This question produces unexpected calm because it reframes uncertainty. The future becomes less threatening when confidence rests on personal competence rather than perfect preservation. Ego seeks certainty through possession. Confidence grows through adaptability. This mindset changes how opportunities are evaluated. Temporary setbacks no longer feel catastrophic. Calculated risks become manageable because recovery feels plausible. Financial decisions expand beyond protection toward thoughtful engagement. Fear loses intensity when loss stops representing finality. Professionals who cultivate recovery confidence often behave differently without appearing reckless. They diversify income sources, invest steadily despite volatility, and remain open to career evolution. Their calm does not come from eliminating risk, but from trusting their ability to navigate change. Money becomes one component of security rather than its sole foundation. Now the perspective shifts again. True financial freedom depends less on never losing money and more on knowing that loss would not define the future. This realization dissolves much of fear's power. Stability comes not from perfect outcomes, but from resilience across imperfect ones. And once trust in recovery replaces fear of loss, financial life opens quietly, allowing individuals to pursue growth with measured confidence, knowing that wealth ultimately rests not only in what they own, but in who they have become capable of being. Now the perspective shifts toward the final realization, the moment when fear of losing money stops directing life itself. Throughout this conversation, a pattern has slowly emerged. Fear rarely announces itself as fear. It appears as caution, responsibility, preparation, and intelligence. It encourages stability, protects against impulsive decisions, and helps individuals build financial foundations. In many ways, fear plays a useful role early in wealth building, but over time, something changes. The same instinct that once protected progress can begin limiting it. Decisions become shaped not by what individuals truly want to build, experience, or explore, but by what they are afraid to lose. Financial life gradually organizes around defense rather than direction. Money becomes the decision maker. Career choices prioritize income preservation over curiosity. Investments prioritize emotional comfort over long-term participation. Lifetiming becomes delayed until risk disappears. Freedom remains theoretical because action waits for certainty. Fear creates invisible boundaries. The shift toward financial maturity begins when individuals recognize that wealth is not meant to eliminate uncertainty. Wealth exists to increase the range of choices available within uncertainty. Money cannot guarantee safety, but it can provide flexibility. And flexibility reduces the need for fear-driven decisions. This realization changes the emotional relationship with money. Instead of asking whether a decision might reduce financial security temporarily, individuals begin asking whether avoiding the decision reduces long-term freedom. The focus moves from preservation to alignment. Money becomes a resource supporting intentional living rather than a fragile asset demanding constant protection. Fear loses authority when purpose becomes clear. You may notice that professionals who appear financially calm are not necessarily those with the largest portfolios. They are often those who no longer require money to provide emotional reassurance. They trust systems they have built, skills they possess, and adaptability they have developed. Money stops carrying emotional urgency. Financial fluctuations become information rather than threats. Career transitions become manageable rather than terrifying. Spending decisions feel balanced because identity is no longer tied tightly to financial outcomes. Security becomes internal rather than external. This transformation does not remove caution or eliminate thoughtful planning. Instead, it introduces proportionality. Risk is evaluated realistically. Protection exists alongside participation. Financial decisions integrate both stability and growth without allowing fear to dominate either. Ego seeks control through avoidance. Wisdom accepts uncertainty with preparation. As fear quiets, something unexpected emerges: mental space. Attention shifts away from constant monitoring toward meaningful engagement with work, relationships, creativity, and personal development. Wealth begins fulfilling its intended purpose, expanding life rather than restricting it. The most profound change is subtle. Money stops controlling emotional state. Market movements, income variations, or temporary setbacks no longer dictate identity or confidence. Financial life becomes steady not because outcomes are perfect, but because perspective has matured. Freedom appears gradually. It shows itself in the ability to wait patiently, to act when opportunity aligns with values, and to tolerate uncertainty without panic. Wealth becomes less about accumulation alone and more about autonomy, the ability to make decisions guided by intention instead of fear. If this conversation resonated with you, consider subscribing to Mindful Wealth. This channel exists for thoughtful professionals seeking deeper understanding of money, success, and modern life. Conversations designed not to motivate, but to clarify. And if someone came to mind while listening, share this episode with them. Sometimes the most valuable shift is not learning something new, but seeing familiar fears more clearly. Until the next conversation, continue building steadily, allowing money to support your decisions rather than control them. Because real wealth often begins at the moment fear stops defining what feels possible.